listener production.
Hey, happy Friday. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to The Briefing. Tasmanians are heading to the polls this weekend to vote in the state election. Among the biggest issues, housing, political donations, cost of living, getting a new anti-corruption commission off the ground, and healthcare. Something that also got thousands riled up at a protest in Hobart last weekend was native forest logging.
Once upon a time, the logging industry could get out thousands of people to support them. They simply just can't hold anything, any public forum or get any public momentum behind the continued destruction of forests in Tasmania, because Tasmanians don't like it and they know that this industry is being heavily subsidised by taxpayer money.
It is a huge issue in our southernmost state, both for the people who are against it and also those who rely on the industry to survive. Today we're talking to activist Bob Brown about the fate of Tassie's native forests. That's coming up in the second half of the episode. First though, Katrina Blowers is here for the headlines. It is Friday the 23rd of March.
Hey guys, well, we're beginning with huge news about Apple. The US Justice Department has launched a landmark lawsuit against the tech giant, accusing it of illegal and anti-competitive practices to maintain market dominance.
Apple has maintained its power not because of its superiority, because of its unlawful exclusionary behavior. Monopolies like Apple's threaten the free and fair markets upon which our economy is based. They stifle innovation, they hurt producers and workers, and they increase costs for consumers.
Stifling innovation and Apple is not a sentence you normally hear together. That was the voice of US Attorney General Merrick Garland there. So in this 88-page lawsuit, Garland went on to explain some of the anti-competitive steps he's accusing Apple of engaging in, saying the company broke antitrust laws by preventing others from offering apps that compete with Apple's products, like its digital wallet. It's also accused of suppressing mobile cloud streaming services and, quote, diminishing the functionality of smartwatches not made by the company. If prosecutors succeed, they could force Apple to alter contracts or even make structural changes within the company. Apple says the case is wrong on the facts and the law, and it's going to vigorously defend itself, Sasha.
Huge news out of the US with this one, but I can totally understand the argument here is that if you are an Apple customer, it's very hard to then kind of use those Apple products elsewhere and vice versa. So it is something that the US has flagged in the past and it's finally kind of happening. And Apple's share of the US smartphone market exceeds 70%. And when you look in the broader smartphone market, it's 65%. And that is huge for one company. You remember back in the days where mobile phones were first a thing, people had Nokias, people had Samsungs, people had, all different types of brands, and now it's weird if someone doesn't have an iPhone. So this will be huge and it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and it's the latest in a series of woes for Apple around the world. We should add in that Australia is also looking at exploring regulation that could force Apple to offer alternative payment options and reduce its commissions in its app store. So it's going to be fighting fires on a whole bunch of fronts.
Hopes of an impending interest rate cut have taken a hit after yesterday's unemployment figures. So this was not what anyone was expecting. Australia's unemployment rate dropped to 3.7%, and it hasn't been that low since September. An extra 116,000 people were in work in February compared to January, according to the Bureau of Statistics. And it is the biggest increase in employment on record outside the pandemic. The RBA does take into account a number of factors when deciding what to do with the official cash rate. The unemployment figure is one of them. So this result is likely to see any future cuts potentially delayed.
Yeah, so Michelle Bullock, the RBA governor, did say in her post-decision press conference the other day that, quote, she wasn't ruling anything in or out. Those 6 words have received a lot of scrutiny from commentators. Many have chosen to skew them as a positive, that she's leaving the door open for adjustments. So one adjustment that could be made is that there is the chance that these numbers could represent a surge in people securing work post post-Christmas. So it could be a bit of a blip on the radar, and we could see a correction in those figures over the coming months. We also know, Sacha, how much interest rates affect cost of living, and here's some new proof with a grim new survey by Finder of more than 3,200 Aussies. It's found that 45% of those surveyed had less than $1,000 in savings, and 20% of respondents had nothing at all. Further to that, 3/4 of us are stressed with our current financial situation, according to the research. No surprise there, I don't think, with those figures.
No, and there were also numbers out yesterday about immigration, which is another kind of hot button topic that's really starting to make its way into the headlines more and more with Australia's housing crisis, with some concerned that with high immigration levels, it's impacting the number of houses available to people to either rent or buy. And so these figures showed net overseas migration last year hit almost 550,000. That was in the 12 months to September, according to the Bureau of Stats. So more than 2,000 migrants a day, and 60% higher than the year before, which of course would have been impacted by the pandemic. The annual increase of almost 550,000 is not what the Albanese government was expecting. They thought migration would be down from 510,000 to 375,000 by June this year. So not close to reaching that target at all. And the first patient to receive a brain chip implant from Elon Musk's startup Neuralink has reported being able to play online chess with his mind. Leonardo DiCaprio, who is 29, became paralysed from the shoulders down after a diving accident 8 years ago and had the chip inserted in January. In a video posted to Neuralink's X account, DiCaprio explains how he started training his brain to use the chip by what's called imagined movement before being able to make it work.
From there, I think it just became intuitive for me to start imagining the cursor moving. Basically, it was like using the force on a cursor, and I could get it to move wherever I wanted. Just stare somewhere in the screen, and it would move where I wanted it to. Which was such a wild experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. A neural engineer, though, is kind of pouring cold water on the excitement, saying it's not that big of a breakthrough and the work is still in its very early phases. But it has been acknowledged how big the impact has been on the recipient's life, allowing him to once again use a computer, Katrina. And Mr. Arbour has also said, look, it's not perfect. They've run into some issues. He doesn't say what issues, which, we know that there have been some problems with Neuralink from the FDA's perspective. There were quality control and record control problems that were being investigated. So we know that Neuralink is maybe trying to keep some of these results close to its chest. But we're in the future. This is amazing.
I agree. I think anything that can help people who, for a start, the benefits of this for people who've lost function, of their limbs in some way, this is extraordinary. But that coupled with AI, who knows what is in the future. And I think the reason why a lot of engineers are going, hey, that's pretty cool, but not that much of a breakthrough is recently a Swiss company enabled a paralysed man to walk again. They used pretty similar technology. So this guy was able to walk just by thinking about the movements involved, and they put electronic implants in his brain and his spine, and that wirelessly communicated thoughts to his legs and feet. So we're on the precipice of something incredible here. But yeah, you're right about the regulations that Neuralink needs to adhere to, and it's a lot of it is to do with animal testing, and we definitely want those things to be corrected, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And it is worth noting as well that Neuralink did not respond to questions put to them by the FDA when these investigations were happening a little while ago. So I think a closer eye is definitely needed. Although, like you said, and I said before, it is a pretty cool thing to see. Hey, Katrina, thanks for joining us for the headlines today. Next up is our deep dive with Bob Brown into native forest logging in Tasmania. When I say Tassie, what springs to your mind? Pristine nature, fresh produce, diverse wildlife. There's no denying one of the state's biggest draw cards is its natural beauty. Its tourism slogan is literally "come down for air." But the issue of nature has been pretty absent from the campaigns of the major parties ahead of tomorrow's state election. According to analysis by The Guardian, not a single press release sent out by Labor or the Liberals since Valentine's Day, over 500 by the way, have mentioned the issue. But a big chunk of the population is worried about Tasmania's native forests, in particular, the logging of them. The Liberal Party is on track to re-election. It's promised to open an additional 40,000 hectares of protected old-growth forests to logging if it wins this weekend, while Labor has promised to keep existing contracts in place until at least 2040. The Greens, on the other hand, want a total ban of the practice. It is concerning for a lot of people who are worried about climate change and the future of native species who call these forests home. But it is also deeply worrying for those that rely on the industry for their livelihood. Today I'm talking to Bob Brown about the issue. He's an environmental activist and one of the founding leaders of the Greens Party. And he joins me now. Bob, thanks for your time today. A recent poll has suggested 57% of Tasmanians support an end to native forest logging. Does that echo support across the rest of the country, or is it higher or lower?
Well, it's weaker in Tasmania than elsewhere in the country because of the enormous public relations campaign run by not just the logging corporations and commercial interests, but by both the major political parties. However, it still is a majority, and that majority is growing. It used to be once upon a time that the logging industry could get out thousands of people to support them. They simply just can't hold anything, any public forum or get any public momentum behind the continued destruction of forests in Tasmania, because Tasmanians don't like it, and they know that this industry is being heavily subsidised by taxpayer money.
I want to ask you then about the support for logging in Tasmania. There's no doubt that people rely on this industry for their livelihoods. I mean, what would the consequences be of doing what the Greens want and completely banning it?
There's every doubt about people relying on it for their livelihood. The logging industry in Tasmania, like elsewhere in the country, is largely based on plantations, which are not contentious, which environmentalists aren't arguing against. 80% of the wood being processed in Tasmania and more than 80% of the jobs are in the plantation industry. So it's just this small remaining rump of native forest destruction that's being argued about, and that's the one that's taking the public money, and that's the one that's largely seeing, well, over 90% of the native forest being exported as wood chip for products that don't last very long in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly to China and Taiwan. And when you look at this industry, much less than 1% of the jobs in Tasmania are involved in it. In fact, less than half of 1%, or getting right down to numbers, less than 300 jobs are involved in cutting down and exporting the logs to the wood chip mills and a very small percentage to sawmills.
You said that the industry has been subsidised heavily by the government. How have they managed this PR campaign then to try and convince people that people are relying on it? Is it simply down to profits and it just makes too much money and they want to protect that?
Well, they do put a lot of money into public relations, but they've had much more than $1 billion, B for billion, out of taxpayers through Canberra and Hobart governments in recent decades. And without that, they could not have run. I'm talking again about this very small fraction of the wood production industry that's involved in native forest destruction. And it's, for example, the log trucks coming out of the southern forests of Tasmania going through Hobart to the wood chip export facilities in northern Tasmania are being subsidised to drive up the main Midland Highway in Tasmania. And on it goes. And what's extraordinary is the penetration through both the corporate sector and the forestry unions into the major political parties that have allowed this to happen. And but, you know, the tide has turned, and the fact that we expected 500, but 3,000 people turned out to a rally to end native forest logging just last Saturday in Hobart shows how big that tide is going, and it must be shaking the ground from under the political parties, including Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, who's been an enormous supporter of this job shedding industry and the environmental destruction that comes with it. And it's about time Canberra, as well as Hobart, took notice of the enormous public sentiment that there is against continuing this when all our wood needs can be met out of plantation forestry. We've got over 2 million hectares of plantations in Australia. We've got over 300,000 hectares of plantations here in Tasmania. New Zealand swapped to a plantation-based industry over 20 years ago and is exporting. So there's no reason Australia can't do that as well, except the vested interests that are making money out of the taxpayer subsidies.
The Liberals look on track to maintain power in Tassie, and they have said they're going to open up an additional 40,000 hectares of old growth forest to logging. That can't be good for this campaign against the practice if we've got another 4 years of Liberal control in Tasmania.
Well, the Liberals are looking weaker than they ever have. They're on about 40%. I don't see there's any way that they can get majority government on Saturday. They're going to have to rely on independents, including potentially one or two independents who separated from them and caused this election. So at best, I think we're going to be back in the situation that Premier Rockcliffe used to call the election a year early. And the question is whether he's going to survive. If that happens, there'll be huge pressure on him to resign as Premier. And Tasmania has a Herr Clark system, which, like Europe, is likely to return a multiplicity of parties and independents. Neither Labor nor Liberal can win a majority. They're going to have to work with other people. And the growing number of other people, including the Greens, who are likely to win 4 seats rather than the 2 they have at the moment, means they're going to have to negotiate. And the parliaments in future are going to be much less supportive of this logging industry than they have in the past. And that includes independent members in the powerful upper house of Tasmania.
All right, let's talk about what the actual issues are with the logging of native forest. Talk us through the environmental impacts and why continuing this practice could be viewed as so dire.
Well, I've been in the Magistrates Court in Hobart for the first 2 days of this week, charged with trespassing in these public forests. And that's for being in an area which was being logged, which had swift parrots trying to nest in it. Now, these birds are magnificent. They're the fastest parrots on Earth. They're listed as critically endangered at state and federal level, as well as internationally by the United Nations. And whereas there was 5,000 in 1980 and 2,000 in 2002, there's now estimated to be about 700, and there will be 70 by 2030. They're on the way down, and the big, they've got a number of factors against them, but the huge one here is if their nesting trees are being destroyed by this logging industry. It says it's going to protect them. It says you should stop logging if there's a swift parrot seen within 500 metres, but they don't. And they are destroying the nesting trees. And even if they were to protect them when the birds are nesting there, the birds migrate back to the mainland for winter and then they cut their trees down. It's an appalling situation. And along with that, they're destroying the habitat of also critically endangered Tasmanian devils, the giant Tasmanian wedge-tailed eagle, the Tasmanian masked owl, which is the largest barn owl in the world, and that includes logging in the rainforest of the Tarkine in northwest Tasmania. And on it goes. There's just a spectrum of these magnificent wildlife as well as plants and rainforest. The Tarkine is the biggest temperate rainforest in Australia. It's as big as the tropical rainforest of the Daintree. And it's being eroded, except by citizens taking action, both in their own locations, but in the more remote areas as well. And what has to be said here is that Tasmania's booming industry, rather than its fading, failed industry like native forest logging, is tourism. And the biggest attractant there is the wild and scenic nature of Tasmania. So people are coming here to see the forest, standing and beautiful and full of life, not horizontal on the back of a log truck.
You had recent support in your activism to protect Tasmania's native forests, and that came from Leonardo DiCaprio, who actually posted about it on Instagram with quite a lot of detail, talking about the swift parrot and also how much Tasmania relies on its natural resources for things like tourism, as you've just mentioned. Were you surprised to get support from Hollywood?
Yeah, it's come twice, and it's come out of the blue. We didn't know it was coming. His first posting about a month ago, and then one just a couple of days ago. Delighted by a very committed environmentalist in Leonardo DiCaprio, and the seriousness with which he's taken this. And naturally, as a result of that, I've written to him and asked him to come and see these magnificent forests. And I think we're going to see more of this that is more international attention focused on Tasmania's forests as we move to become the last state in Australia which is still logging its forests, although it unfortunately is still occurring in New South Wales and in Queensland.
Look, before we let you go, Bob, I'd love to know what you would encourage voters who are heading to the polls in Tassie this weekend to think about when they're casting their ballot, especially when it comes to native forest logging in the state.
People should think about their kids and the future, not about just what's being offered now, even though the Greens are at the forefront of that. But they should be thinking, is my vote going to pave the way for a better world?
Bob Brown, thanks so much for talking to us today, and also wanted to throw in before you leave, there are further protests happening this weekend in support of ending forest logging in Australia. So thank you so much for your time and for chatting to us today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is all we have time for this morning, but we'll be back this afternoon with another deep dive. And if you enjoyed this episode and like listening to the briefing, why not share it with a friend? It is a big help for us so we can keep bringing you interesting and thought-provoking conversations. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.